historic shocks we have seen the last years. The global economy has shown remarkable resilience, and the German economy has shown resilience as well. Think about the energy situation you have mentioned. We had to reinvent the German energy infrastructure and supply in the last 18 months. And so we have not the growth perspective we are expecting, but our economy has shown this resilience. Looking to what will come over the next years, Christine said, okay, we are in the process of normalization. I would say we are witnessing a new normal, and 2023 marks this new normal. Think about the rise of artificial intelligence we all have discussing here in Davos. Think about the geopolitical tension and the threat of fragmentation we will have to deal with over the next years. The higher debt levels after the pandemic and the energy price hikes, which has shrunk our fiscal space to finance transformation. And given the very little growth perspective of the global economy, we have to answer the question how we will be able in the future to finance transition by the private capital market and how to fight poverty around the world. So for me, it's not normalization, it is a new normal which we have to be prepared for. And has 2023 given me hope, you asked? I would put it this way, it was a call for action, because we have to rearrange some policies, and probably we see a new need for structural reforms. Probably we are at the beginning of an era of new structural reforms.
Minister Al-Judaan, what do you see as the main risks, compared to maybe the resilience that we saw last year?
There are a few things. I think I would just put, possibly, from what I've heard, a little bit of context. Obviously, there are the immediate risks that will be obvious, which is geopolitics, fragmentation, and obviously the debt situation, particularly in low-income countries. And we are talking about them, and we realize that they actually pose risks, but that will add to inflation and monetary tightening. But these are the immediate ones. We need to attend to them. But then I think we need to make sure that we also attend to the medium term. I mean, the projections that we have seen from the World Bank or the IMF clearly suggest that this decade would be the lowest growth potential for the world economy compared to the first decade of this century and the second decade. And yesterday, Ajay Banga said in one of the panels a very nice statement. I will quote him. He said, "These are projections, they are not our destiny. And therefore, we should actually see what can we do to form our destiny by actually changing the way we do things, by adopting policies that will actually fuel growth." These are very important, and again, in relation to low-income countries. Low-income countries are actually coming under a serious crunch of debt, and for them to be able to grow, they need to invest. And for them to invest, we need to restructure their debt and allow them access to money that they can then fuel their own growth, which will help the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. David Rubenstein, what do you worry about the most in 2024? There are many things to worry about.
Well, I worry about everything, but I would say the most important thing I wanted to convey is that predictions made in January about what's going to happen in the remainder of the year is generally wrong. Last year at this time, here and other forums around the world, people were predicting the U.S. would likely have a hard landing, if not a hard landing, a soft landing, but a soft landing implies very low growth. As it turns out, while the numbers aren't really in yet, the U.S. will have grown probably around 2.5% for 2023, which is much better than anybody really projected at the time. The U.S. has its challenges for sure, but inflation is coming down, and as a result of that, the Federal Reserve is likely to reduce interest rates relatively in the near future. In our country, we have a presidential election. I think everybody probably recognizes that, and as a result, the Federal Reserve wants to get its, its rate cuts out of the way before the presidential election is in full steam. Because if you have rate cuts right before a presidential election, it will be seen as helping the candidate who's in the White House, because it'll gin up the economy, is the theory. And so the Republican nominee would not be happy with that. So the Fed is going to get 3 rate cuts in or more this year, as I expect it will. It will have to get those done relatively in the first quarter, certainly in the first half. So you can expect to see rate cuts. And that will probably drive the U.S. economy. During presidential election years, the U.S. economy generally does pretty well. We tend not to be in recessions in presidential election years because Congress spends a lot of money, and the Fed tends to be relatively easy on monetary policy during presidential election years. The biggest risk for the U.S. economy is the usual risk that everybody has. Are we going to be in a war somewhere, something like that? Is there going to be another pandemic? But it's really like we look out in the mirror and the enemy is us. Because the biggest risk we really have is the dysfunction of the U.S. government, our inability to pass appropriation bills that fund the government on time, the inability to deal with the debt limit issues on time. Those are the biggest things that worry me, whether at some point the U.S. government just can't get these issues done because of the political problems we have in the country. And as a result, I worry more about that than other things in terms of the U.S. economy going forward. We will have a presidential election year, and almost everything every candidate will say will probably not be true about what will happen in the future, because they probably won't be able to get done what they say they're going to get done, but it'll be interesting to watch.
But David, a number of leaders have expressed concern of what Donald Trump in the White House means for fragmentation, for foreign policy. Right. Is there any way that the rest of the world can Trump-proof their economies?
If somebody has a way to do that, I think they should patent it and probably sell it to somebody else. But it'd be very difficult to do. Clearly, the biggest political change that occurred in the United States last year also was unpredictable, or unpredicted, I should say. I don't think anybody outside of the Trump family would have predicted that Donald Trump would be indicted 4 times, 91 counts on various indictments, and that his popularity would soar to the point where he has a reasonably good chance of locking up the Republican nomination by March, which is earlier than almost any contested presidential candidate has been able to lock up the Republican nomination. If he is nominated, it'll be the first time ever that a Republican Party has nominated the same person 3 times in a row. He clearly has a following that many of the analysts missed, and I don't think any of the court cases are likely to change his momentum. So I think people should recognize that he's a serious political force and should not discount the fact that he could well be elected again, despite the fact that many people in Europe, where we are now, are not really his biggest fans. And so I wouldn't rule out his possibly getting elected again. Joe Biden shouldn't be discounted. Obviously, we have 2 older candidates. People have suggested to me that I should run for president, but I say I'm only 74 and you need to be older to run. So, but I do think, to be very serious, it'll be a relatively close election. And the final comment is, in our country, in the last 2 presidential elections, 45 states out of the 50 voted exactly the same way in each of those 2 elections. Only 5 states voted differently. Those 5 states are Arizona, Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those 5 states are the only ones that voted differently in those 2 elections. Right now, Donald Trump is ahead in all 5 of those states. He lost all 5 of those states last time. Hillary Clinton lost those 5 states as well. Biden won them last time. So everything will get down to those 5 states, and right now, if the election were held today, it would be difficult to see how Trump would lose that election today, but it's a long way away. And the most important thing you can say about presidential elections in our country is things change all the time, and we won't know for sure probably until about a month before the election where it's really going to go.
So, Minister Lindner, how should Europe prepare? And again, how difficult is it as a finance minister to look at models? This is for Minister Lindner. How difficult is it to look at models to forecast, given all the crises, given the elections, and actually you don't really know what you're left with in 12 months.
Well, I think we are talking too much about Donald Trump in Europe, and we should prepare ourselves for a possible second term for Donald Trump by fostering our European competitiveness. Doing our homework is the best preparation for a possible second term of Donald Trump, and this includes our capabilities to defend ourselves, being an attractive partner on eye level when it comes to the economic situation and when it comes to a fair burden sharing under the roof of NATO is the best we can do to be in a good partnership with the United States. And then it doesn't matter which administration, if we are attractive, if we do not have to ask others because we have capabilities ourselves, it's the best way to cooperate. And this is completely for both possible outcomes of the election in the United States, doing our homework.
Madame Lagarde?
I'd love to follow up on what Christian is saying. I think the best defense, if that's the way we want to look at it, is attack. And to attack properly, you need to be strong at home. So being strong means having a strong, deep market, having a real single market, and we should be expecting some suggestions by Enrico Letta, former Prime Minister of Italy, who is in charge of producing this report on how we can deepen and improve the functioning of that single market, which is a huge economic zone in the world, but which is not completely a single market yet, as many CEOs, I'm sure, experience on a daily basis. And we should, more importantly, make sure that the money that is saved in Europe, or the money that is associated with pension, is actually invested in a capital market union that actually functions efficiently to rally the investment that we badly need for the transition towards a greener economy, which relies certainly for a period of time on fossil fuel, but less so, as was indicated in the last COP28, and moves towards renewable, where investment is badly needed.
May I add just one little aspect, because I am grateful that Christine has mentioned the Capital Markets Union. I'm concerned that some policymakers in the European Union tend to follow the United States to subsidize almost everything. But we have to avoid a subsidy race we cannot afford. I'm curious of the next US administration can continue the way they support their economy. I wonder if it's sustainable to pay so high subsidies. But what we have to do is to improve our framework conditions for our economies and to make further progress in capital markets union. Our competitive disadvantage compared to the US is not subsidies, it's the function of our private capital market.
Mr. President, Singapore is, of course, a country that does well when the world is working well together, less well when China and the US are falling apart. So what's your take on this US-China stress?
Well, I think the US-China relationship is the central axis of tension when you look at the largest problems we face in the world. And it has to be refashioned into the central axis of partnership. They look at each other fundamentally as adversaries, and then they look for opportunities to cooperate within that framework. It has to be flipped around. Fundamentally, they have to be partners, because the challenges that they both face are the same. Climate change, a lack of global order, a breaking up of the global trading system. They're challenges that both of them face, and both of them will suffer for it. And the two are absolutely essential to any solution, to climate, to peace, and to an open global trading system. And then within that, you can argue, you can badger, you can ensure fair competition, you can ensure that there's a way of dealing with each other that's consistent with the principles of openness and fair play. But we've got to flip things around, where you're not fundamentally adversaries, to one where you're fundamentally partners, and then you argue about specifics. That's the fundamental repositioning that's required. So it's not just about a pause in the relationship, it's really about a repositioning in the relationship.
Dr. Ngozi, if we move it forward, there are 3-4 pillars that we need to put in place to foster growth. And I don't know whether this year there will be a lot of distractions that keep us further away from that goal, but what would you focus on to bring back longer sustainable growth?
Well, thank you. And I just want to say that I strongly support what Christian and Christine said. I think the best way to be prepared for any eventuality is to focus on those things you need to do anyway. For me at the WTO, I don't fret about who is going to come or what is happening. Maybe that's an overstatement. But in a way, it's focusing on what do we need to do to strengthen and reform the organization so that whatever the circumstance, it will be able to deliver what it's supposed to deliver for people. So if we keep doing that, I think that's a strong answer, a bit of offense in that regard. But with respect to what are the pillars we should look at for restoring growth, I think that's a very good conversation because we focus a lot on the pessimistic things that might happen. But there are some bright shoots that I want to talk about on the trade side. First, I want to mention that in spite of all the uncertainties that we talk about, and I pointed to in the beginning, trade has been largely resilient. It is because of trade that Europe was able to find other sources of energy from the US and the Gulf and elsewhere to make up for the withdrawal of energy from Russia. It's because of trade that 35 countries dependent on the Black Sea region from Africa were able to find alternative sources of grain fertilizer. So trade has been a force for resilience. And there are some bright spots in trade that we need to be conscious of. There's digital trade and services trade is growing fast, especially digitally delivered services trade, growing at 8% per annum. And that is a very, very interesting thing because now we're all talking of digital platforms, AI, and this is a positive sign. And we should be preparing ourselves to say, how do we support such trade? How do we make sure that it benefits small and medium enterprises, women, those at the margin? Green trade has tripled from 2000 to now, tripled in value to $1.9 trillion. That's another opportunity. And finally, I want to say that the reshaping of supply chains, I see that as an opportunity and not a challenge. And when you see it as an opportunity, it could help us look at other sources of growth. If you take just one supply chain that we talked about here, the critical minerals and critical raw material supply chain, we have the possibility that these critical raw materials are found in many developing countries who did not benefit as much from the first phase of integration into the global economy. There is now a chance to bring them in through developing these supply chains in place because they have two advantages, not only the raw materials, but also green energy. So combining those two, and I'm glad to say that Chancellor Schulz and Europe has caught on to this, you can go to Africa or Latin America and develop these supply chains, bring in new sources of growth, create new employment, lift people up from poverty in these countries. So those are some good opportunities that are out there, some hope.
David?
On trade, whoever is elected president is not likely to enter into a lot of trade agreements. The word trade in the United States or trade agreements is almost a curse word now. Somebody is in the audience here, Mike Froman, who negotiated the TPP agreement under President Obama. That couldn't even get a vote in the United States Congress, and I don't think any major trade agreement could be approved by our current Congress, and I don't think it's going to change for a while, no matter who the president is, unfortunately, because trade is often seen by certain constituencies in the United States as favoring jobs offshore and not really is not popular at all. Even Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, was against the TPP, even though it had been negotiated by a Democratic administration in which she had served. On U.S.-China, U.S.-China is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. There's no doubt about it. But there is no political benefit in the United States about saying anything beneficial or good about China during a presidential election year. So President Biden and President Trump, I don't think, or either one, are going to say we need to have closer ties with China, and I'm going to be nicer to China than I was before. It's just not going to happen during a presidential election year. Hopefully, after the election's over, the progress that's been made recently at the APEC meeting can see something blossom, but I don't think you'll see anything blossom before then, though hopefully the Chinese will provide some pandas again to the United States, which we desperately would like to have.
Minister Al-Juden, what are some of the policies that you think we need to put in place now to make sure that there's success in 4 or 5 years that we're maybe not thinking about as much as we should?
First of all, I would like just to follow up on this. I was talking to a U.S. friend yesterday about almost the same subject, and I asked him whether he is optimistic, and he said, well, at least it is only 4 years, and someone else will come. So it would be interesting to see what is going to happen in the next 4 years. But more seriously, I think what needs to be done is looking at how can you actually mobilize your own resources, how can you do structural reform. I can tell you from experience, and I'm not here really to promote what Saudi is doing, but from experience, what we have done in the last 7 years actually helped us significantly in our resilience to deal with the multiple shocks that we are facing, including what the current situation, geopolitical tension. So structural reforms are critically important. Local revenue mobilization is actually very important for countries. And obviously, the support of multilateral development institutions to catalyze private sector investments in developing nations, and particularly low-income countries, is very critical. Catalyzing that is, I think, will be, and I'm actually very optimistic with the reform that the World Bank is doing, and actually bringing MEGA, IFC, and their own IBRD and IDA together to make sure that they provide that support and catalyze more private investments in low-income countries. I think this is promising, and I would love to see some results actually this year.
Mr. President, you worry about something that we're not really talking about, and this is fiscal spending. Are we sowing now the seeds to have an even bigger crisis 4, 5, 6 years from now?
Well, I think the most important and most neglected area of public policy is fiscal reform. Christian spoke about the already very high debt levels, so we're starting in the wrong place, and we're going to have to address challenges in the future that are going to have to require more fiscal investments. We're neglecting the issues because it's never pleasant to talk about raising revenues or raising taxes. It's never pleasant to talk about redirecting subsidies or redirecting spending. So we're just merrily gliding into the future, tinkering at the edges. And even the most major international tax reform of recent years, through the G20, was really about something very small to do with corporate taxes and rearranging and reallocating corporate taxes. It's a very small issue compared to the challenges we really face. The big issues are, how do we address the climate transition? How do we address the needs of aging societies and broken social security systems? And how do we address a challenge of an AI era and ensuring that populations can cope with it and benefit from it? It's all going to require the public sector. So if I just take the first, there is no realistic solution to the climate transition that does not involve a globally coordinated system of carbon taxes. There's no realistic or fair solution that does not involve a globally coordinated system of carbon taxes. And Ngozi at the WTO is coordinating this with several other international organizations. It's still early days. There's a perception that it's unjust, it's unfair, it'll lead to inflation. In fact, quite the contrary. If we don't do this, the countries that will suffer most ultimately are the developing countries. They're going to be the worst affected by climate change. If we don't do this, it's ordinary vulnerable communities that will suffer the most. What we need is a system of carbon taxes coupled with subsidies for vulnerable households and a stream of funding for the developing world to allow them to engage in investments in mitigation and adaptation that allows them to keep growing. And that's a real opportunity. It's a fair solution, and it's the only realistic solution, and we can't keep ducking it. Second, there's a huge opportunity of redirecting subsidies. The IMF has estimated that about $1.3 trillion is spent each year in fuel subsidies. That's about 5 times more the amount of subsidies that goes into green technologies and green energy. We've got to redirect it. Redirect those fuel subsidies to helping vulnerable households, to helping firms to adjust, and to spurring renewables and other green technologies. That's a major redirection. It's fair, it's sustainable, and it's realistic. It has to be achieved. The third issue that's maybe the most neglected is preparing for an aging society with confidence. And it means rejigging in significant ways of social security systems and healthcare financing systems. It's not sustainable. Too many people who don't need support are getting support, and too many people who need support the most in healthcare systems are not getting enough support. So there has to be a reshaping of that curve of subsidies within healthcare to benefit those who need it the most. There has to be more spending on preventive or preemptive healthcare spending to help people stay healthy for as long as they can, rather than wait for the very expensive occasions when they have to end up in hospital, particularly for acute care. So fundamental reform to healthcare and fundamental reform to labor markets to allow people to stay engaged at work if they wish for as long as possible. Those are very important shifts in social policy. So we have to get real. The challenges we face are different from the past. We're not going to address them by just tinkering around the edges with rearranging corporate taxes and the like. It requires raising taxes to take on the climate transition. It requires redirecting subsidies to be fair and to ensure that as we age, no one is vulnerable, and we can actually sustain high-quality healthcare systems and social security systems. It requires change, and we discuss this very rarely. We have here 5 current and former finance ministers who've gone through years of discussion at the G20, at the IMF. We spend a lot of time talking about monetary policy. We spend very little time talking about fiscal policy reforms for a more secure future.
On that, can I just say on that point, fiscal reform in the United States, very difficult to do. We now have $34 trillion of debt, $34 trillion of debt. The interest on it is approaching our defense budget. And if we don't resolve this in the near future, something's going to happen to the dollar. The dollar has been the only reserve currency for quite some time. But if the United States can't get its fiscal act together, at some point, people are going to do what they did to the British pound and the Dutch guilder years ago when too much money was borrowed by those countries and their currency didn't become as valuable and therefore lost its reserve status. The U.S. doesn't have any real challenger right now to reserve currency status for the dollar, but it will if it keeps doing what it's doing. We have 122% of our GDP in debt, and we are each year our budget deficit is probably about 25% of our spending. And we just can't keep doing that, but there is nobody in the United States government that I see is really seriously addressing that problem, but it will be a big problem in the not too distant future.
Thank you. Dr. Ngozi?
Well, maybe you're pointing to me because I was nodding so much when Taman was talking, and that's why he's a favorite. I mean, we have to look at what we need to do on the fiscal side to finance the green transition. The money isn't coming. The amounts are huge in the trillions needed. You know, you take Africa, for instance, it needs $190 billion to finance per year, up to 2030 to finance the green transition. What is it getting now? Minute amounts. How is it going to be raised? So we have to think of sensible things like, how do we raise that money? So that's one. The second is business. They're facing a lot of regulatory fragmentation. There are 73 different carbon taxing and pricing regimes in the world today. They are confused. When they go from one country to the other, they have to think about a different way and a different system. So how do we bring this together? So if we have a common methodology or framework for a global carbon pricing regime, I think that will help. And then we can use some of those resources that would be raised to help finance the green transition in those vulnerable countries that don't have the resources. So that was why I was nodding so vigorously. And I think developing countries need to get behind it. The international financial institutions have all been working on this in parallel. The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the OECD. And finally, we are coming together in one task force to try to see if we can put all our energies together and develop a common methodology or framework. We know that not every country is going to have a carbon price or tax. The US will never do it. They will approach it through regulation and subsidies and other means. But once we have a common framework, we can all measure what we are doing against that. And more importantly, we can transfer some of the resources raised to help finance the green transition. So thank you for raising that.
No. Dr. Ngozi, I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes because you have an important meeting. So a very quick question to you. Why has it been so slow? Is it because we're distracted with other crises? And are you confident that actually all of this is going in the right direction?
Well, it's so slow because, I mean, when you talk of raising taxes or prices, it's never a popular subject anywhere. As Tarman said, you have so many former present finance ministers on the panel, and we know what this means. It's politically difficult to talk about raising tax the problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngozi. I know you have to go. Minister Al-Jadaan.
I think a few points, and I listened to Mr. President, and we spoke briefly before we came on stage. I would like, first of all, I think let us agree that climate change is real. Risks from climate change are real, and we should work all together to find solutions that would help the planet and the livelihood of people. I think we are all in agreement. I remember in 2014, when Paris Agreement was reached, developed nations have committed $100 billion annually for developed countries to deal with climate change and for them to transition out of carbon-intensive energy. What have we seen so far? Almost zero. Almost zero. And I can understand Mr. President's enthusiasm about carbon tax and how it may change the equation, but then he linked it to two things. Subsidies to those who are in need. I agree, whenever you raise cost on your community or others, you need to look out for the less fortunate and provide social safety net. Agreed. The second caveat, Mr. President said, is we need to find a way that we channel part of that to low-income countries. We tried that and it failed. Now, so trying something else similar to what you have tried before and expect different results, it's very difficult. There are a lot of political resistance from developed nations. Politically, internally. I mean, we have heard just now some of the comments. So to say that we will put the tax, but then we will direct some of it to low-income countries is going to be very difficult politically, extremely difficult. Third, I would just remind ourselves that while we are enjoying the heated conference place here, there are over 600 million people in Africa that have no basic electricity. Not intermittent, basic, absolutely no electricity. So to say to them, go and eat cake, why are you, looking for a bread, is hypocrisy, in my opinion. They have their own endowment. We should help them get that endowment from under their feet. Gas, for example, let them fuel their own transition. Allow them to use their own endowment. Help them to use their youth, empower their youth, reskill their youth, train their youth. That is really what is going to change Africa and other low-income countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Minister Lindner?
I hope nobody tells my coalition partners and colleagues in cabinet that we are here considering raising taxes. Would cause serious problems for me domestically. Seriously, I would like to widen the perspective a bit. I completely share the idea of fighting global warming by ambitious action. But we should think about the right methodology. I think there is an alternative to carbon tax, and the alternative is a carbon market. In Germany, it is extremely costly to avoid further emissions. And I wonder if the same amount of money we have to spend in Germany would have an even better effect on other places, at other places on the world. For example, to invest in electricity production in Africa with renewable energy as part of a compensation of a German steel industry and for their emissions could have globally a better effect with lower investment. And it doesn't matter where carbon dioxide is emitted, it is a global challenge. So probably we should ask OECD to work on a common framework for a global carbon market, as they did successfully on the global minimum taxation. If I'm allowed to, I would like to add a second remark. To finance all our needs for transition, fighting poverty, and to prepare for the aging societies, I think there's one solution. Given the demographics, given the investment needs, I think we have to foster our productivity. And this is why I'm advocating for structural reforms in the labor markets, in technology, cutting red tape, being more competitive when it comes to corporate taxation. And, well, obviously I'm talking about the reform agenda of Germany, but I think others have to face similar challenges. We in Germany, we have to do our homework, and probably we are part of a model because others have similar challenges. We had to solve our debt and deficit issues, which made me becoming the loneliest minister in cabinet. But we succeeded to solve our debt issues, and now we have to strengthen the supply side. And I know what some of you are thinking. Germany probably is a sick man. Germany is not the sick man. Germany is, after a very successful period since 2012 and these years of crisis, Germany is a tired man after a short night, and the low growth expectations are partly a wake-up call, and now we have a good cup of coffee, which means structural reforms, and then we will be continuing to succeed economically.
Thank you so much, Minister. We only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to call on Madame Lagarde, and then David, President and Minister.
But I'll save them for next year.
David, and then the
Paraphrase President in my country, ask not what the World Economic Forum can do for you, but what you can do for the World Economic Forum. Now, what do I mean by that? The purpose of the forum, and I can't speak for it because Klaus is the person who is really the most responsible to be able to speak for it, but I can say that the purpose of for this purpose is to inspire people. What we've tried to do in this panel and in other panels around the World Economic Forum is inspire people and educate people. And hopefully when you go back to your country, you'll educate yourself about some of the things that we talked about here that you might be inspired to learn more about, and try to pick one issue of the ones we talked about where you make yourself not only well educated about it, better educated than now, but try to make some difference in your own country to try to bring forward some of these ideas. Because the only way we're really going to be effective at the World Economic Forum is we have people that come to the sessions, and those people are watching on streaming. They are going to take these ideas and do something useful with them by working in their own countries to kind of educate people about these things. And that's what I really hope all of you will do, is take something away from this session and say, I'm now inspired to learn more about this issue or that issue, and I'm going to try to do something in my country to make it more likely that that will happen. Thank you.
Thank you. In 30 seconds or 1 minute, Mr. President, what are you positive about?
So, I agree entirely that we need carbon markets. That itself is a complex endeavor, but we need to develop it and we need to make it global. It's not a substitute for carbon taxes, for a very simple reason. Governments are going to have to invest significantly more than they've invested before. We want the private sector to fund most of the transition, but about a third of the investment is going to have to come from government. Because of externalities and other reasons, it has to be funded. It has to be funded. And we can't, there's no magical thinking here. Funding requires taxes of one form or another. The alternative is more and more borrowing, which Christian will be the first to agree, is not sustainable. So let's not duck the issue. Our real challenge is political. It is unpopular to raise any taxes. You have to design taxes together with subsidies so as to make it acceptable and fair. And that's the task of finance ministers. And we've got to coordinate this as much as possible globally so there are no leakages. Design taxes and subsidies so that we can get ahead on this, invest at a higher level, and make it fair for ordinary people. The developing world, I quite agree with both Al-Jadaan and Christine. It is an opportunity. We have the opportunity, in fact, of growing green energy-powered industry in parts of the world which have lots of sun and wind. We have the opportunity of shaping growth strategies that are sustainable, but it's going to require investment. It's going to require support from the advanced world, going to require a much enhanced role for the international financial institutions. We can achieve it. So all I'm saying at the end of the day is our political antennae have gotten too short. We're all looking at the next elections in a whole range of countries, and the consequence if we carry on that way is going to be much more pain in future and a much higher hurdle that future politicians will need to cross. So let's start moving now, face things in realistically, make sure that it's fair and just, and avoid piling up a large problem for the future.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. You got the optimistic guide to 2024 and the pessimistic guide to 2024 and beyond. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And I would love if the audience could also stay in their seat, also the panelists, because it's my great pleasure to welcome on the stage the President of the World Economic Forum, Borge Brende, for the closing remarks of this 54th World Economic Forum.
Thank you very much to this excellent panel. I think you revived a bit of optimism, but also a lot of realism. I remember when as a young student in economics, it was said that if you bring 5 economists in the same room, there will be 8 different opinions. I think we could get some real consensus takeaway from this panel, especially when it comes to rebuilding trust. And that is also the theme of this annual meeting. So on behalf of our chairman, Professor Klaus Schwab, managing board, including myself, I would really like to use this opportunity to thank you for your active participation in the World Economic Forum's 54th annual meeting in Davos. This year's meeting came at a critical and complex moment, not only for the world, but for each person in it, something that was also alluded by the panel, also underlining the importance of inclusion. Rising global temperatures, a still fragile economy, and a deteriorating security landscape are challenges that are not bound by borders. They affect us all. There's no longer such a thing as a country, company, or community insulated from global shocks. And when it comes to leveraging opportunities, it is not possible to do so alone. Yet, we know the foundation of cooperation, trust, has been eroding in recent years, which is why this week's meeting on rebuilding trust has been so important. Leaders from around the world, from the public and private sectors, and from across generations, gathered to show what can be achieved by working together. And I'm really heartened to see the impact. The annual meeting hosted 3,000 leaders, including 350 heads of state and governments and ministers. The presence of top government leaders alongside major CEOs across all industries fostered a new spirit of solidarity and cooperation, even among those with differing perspectives. It enabled the forum to continue its tradition of providing a space for diplomacy. More than 80 national security advisors from governments and international organizations met in Davos ahead of the meeting to advance a blueprint for peace, and world leaders voiced their support for President Zelensky and Ukraine. We hosted leaders from across the Middle East with the aim of supporting efforts to lower tensions and advance a path to peace. The forum's Friends of the African Continental Free Trade Area launched the first ever private sector action plan. We convened leaders from the Western Balkans and the EU who reiterated their commitment to a common European future underpinned by regional growth and stability. And the Humanitarian and Resilience Investing Initiative announced over 50 commitments that will boost impact investment and could unlock over 15 billion in frontier markets. The meeting focused on reviving the growth needed to strengthen our economies and societies. The Future of Growth initiative, supported by a new framework that looks beyond GDP growth, will be a 2-year campaign to help policymakers and economists share new ideas and best practices to balance growth with innovation, inclusion, sustainability and resilience goals. The TradeTech Global Initiative outlined a vision for the collaborative use of technology for global commerce to unlock trillions in trade. New insights on the future of global fintech chartered a path to resilient and inclusive growth in the industry. And the Future of Industrial Strategies initiative shed light on the opportunities for companies and governments to co-create the next generation of industrial strategies. Participants made significant progress on climate action, nature protection and energy transition. The First Movers Coalition has grown to almost 100 companies, providing the world's largest demand signal for breakthrough climate technologies in high-emission industry sectors such as steel and cement. and the World Economic Forum's Trillion Trees platform, that I know many of you are very committed to, announced over 100 companies pledging to conserve, restore and grow 12 billion trees. The forum launched a network to mobilize clean energy investment for the Global South to help unlock an estimated 3 trillion needed for the energy transition. The Global Plastic Action Partnership welcomed Colombia and the Philippines, bringing the network of national action partnerships to 14. Technology, and particularly AI, was top of mind, and participants proposed balancing innovation and protection to ensure responsible development. The AI Governance Alliance announced a new global effort to increase AI access. The Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution that we have created expanded with new centers in Germany, Vietnam, and Qatar, and intends, amongst others, to launch also now a center in Ukraine, in Kiev. Uplink raised 43 million in funding to help early-stage impact entrepreneurs scale their people and planet-focused ventures. And the Global Collaboration Village, that I hope you all visited, demonstrated the potential of next-generation technology to drive inclusion and sustainability. None of these developments can be advanced without investments in people and equitable opportunities. The Reskilling Revolution initiative announced that it has reached more than 680 million people with opportunities for improving education skills and job opportunities. And the Philippines, Vietnam, and Qatar have joined a growing network of 20 country accelerators focusing on human capital investments. The forum launched a new global gender parity sprint to accelerate economic parity by 2030, engaging 5 industries and 15 country accelerators. The Edison Alliance announced it has improved the lives of 784 million people through 320 initiatives across 127 countries on closing the digital divide. And the Global Alliance for Women's Health announced 42 organizations and have pledged 55 million to improve women's health and outcomes worldwide. And now I have cut 3 pages on the list here of other initiatives. I think the reason why I'm mentioning all this is showing that our annual meeting is also about impact, and it's also about walking the talk. And I'm really proud of what we have achieved in Davos in just a week. It is a proof that cooperation can deliver results. Now is the time, as we look a year ahead, to scale this progress. I look forward to seeing the forum continue to work with all of you on these initiatives throughout the year, so that when we meet again a year from now, we will have made measurable progress on advancing our economic, environmental, and security priorities. At the end, I would also like to thank those that have worked so hard on making this annual meeting a reality. And a special thank to my colleague, Marek Dusek, that is in charge of the annual meeting, and his team doing the programming and the events. Really a big, big thank you. And I would also like to thank all my colleagues at the World Economic Forum that have worked 24/7 in making this happen. It's very rewarding, but I think we're all looking forward to not wake up at 5:30 tomorrow morning. So safe travels back home. And again, big thank you to this excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you.